And we are now moving to the next session. We know we already have the definition. We know we have to report it. And now we are reaching a very important thing, how to communicate all this. And in this session, we will first have a presentation again by the task force, which will be presented by Ingvild from Norwegian Medicines Agency. And then we will have the panel. We are having there Ansela Santos Quintana from Health Action International. Yeah, hello. We are having Doreen Postma, representing pharmacists from Netherlands. We are having Thiago Villanueva, Vice Chair-elect, representing Organization of General Practitioners, and we are having François Bovy, representing FPA. Before we go to the presentation, I have to apologize that probably I have to leave before the session ends, because in addition to availability problem of medicines, I'm having also availability problem of flights to Estonia, so maybe I will leave a little bit earlier, but Noel will be then finishing here. So, please, Ingvild, floor is yours.
Thank you. Afternoon, everyone. Hope you had a nice cup of coffee. Just a technical thing. Do I move on this one?
Yes, try. Yeah.
This one? Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Ingvild Knudsen. I work in the communication unit at the Norwegian Medicines Agency. I'm also co-chairing this working group on communication with Juan. And I'm also a member of the working group, the HMA network of communication professionals. Just a short comment on the situation in Norway. I think we are a small country. We have a lot of shortages. I think in last year we had more than 300 notifications. Usually the shortages are solved by allowing the dispensation of foreign packages. But in doing so, there is a need for communication to healthcare professionals, so the management of this can go as swiftly as possible. And actually, I did look at our website just to count the number of press releases, or we call them news items because they're not really press releases. They never hit the press anyway. And it's like 15 press releases from the 1st of October, and they're all shortages that are not, the impact is not serious, but we're actually asking the healthcare professionals in pharmacies to take action. And in doing so, you need to communicate. Because in dispensing the medicine, they are dispensing a foreign package. It's a wrapping or a package in Italian. There is no Norwegian package leaflet. And in dispensing the medicine, they can give the patient important advice. So even though we do have a lot of press releases, there is no much press coverage on the specific cases in the media, but there's more coverage on, lately it has been coverage on the general problem, the global problem of shortages and the root causes and how to be prepared. So the headlines is not necessarily a shortage of this and that and so on from the Norwegian Medicines Agency. It's more like 2,500 could die as a result of a 3-week shortage of a specific medicine. So it's, in a sense, I think that's good that there is some attention of the root causes and how difficult this issue is. And still, there's a lot of work behind the scenes so that the patient will not feel the impact of the specific shortages which we are dealing with every day, so on. But in that aspect, communication is key. So we did, in order to improve external communication to the public and increase or ensure transparency, you need to have an overview of what's the communication practices in the different member states. And so as a basis of this, we wanted to make some best practice guidance for the regulators or for the national authorities. And you could say it doesn't really have to be called best practice, it could be good practice, because best practice is not necessarily, in one country, is not necessarily the best practice in another country. This is how shortages might look from a comms perspective, because when I look around, to neighbouring countries after I publish a shortage news item. I never find the same shortage in the other countries usually. So basically, it's been very interesting to get an overview of what the other countries are doing, because that's not something I knew, and I didn't get an impression that we had the same problem really, except for there's a huge number of shortages. So I think this has been quite interesting for us. And I might have to add that there was the response rate on the survey that was sent in May was on human medicines. There's also been done on the veterinarian side. It was quite good. In these 30 respondents, there are 2 from Germany, of course, because they have separate institutions, and the EMA is included. But the response rate was quite good. These are the specific questions, just a snapshot of the question to give you an impression. We wanted to get a picture of not just the factual or the facts that they do publish on their website or shortage catalogue. A shortage catalogue is a systematic listing of the shortages with specific facts connected to that, the duration of the shortage, the trade name, the pharmaceutical form, and so on. But we were interested in getting an impression of how the agencies are working, how's the internal cooperation within the agency, how do they interact with other stakeholders like patient organization and healthcare professionals. So these are one of 3 slides, key outcomes. Almost all authorities, or 26 out of 30, publish information on shortages on their website. Of these, 23 have a dedicated web page, such as a catalogue, a systematic listing of the shortages. The majority do not have a criteria for publication. So they publish shortages as they occur. Most authorities update the catalogue as new information becomes available. But some review the information on regular intervals, but the most common thing was to update as continuously. And the minority keep resolved shortages on their website. And I know that my agency does that, and I think that's because sometimes you get questions, what was about this specific medicine again? And then you sort of know it's been resolved, it's okay. But most authorities also communicate on revocation or suspensions for quality or safety reasons, and withdrawals due to commercial reasons. But I must say that most of the cases we had in Norway, very few were as a result of revocation, suspensions or withdrawals. They were all basically a result of difficulties in the manufacturing processes and logistics and so on. So we also wanted to know how's the internal procedure in the agencies. In most cases, the communication materials are prepared by those involved in the assessment, and that's in many cases the inspectorate. But sometimes communication colleagues are involved as well. I think it's about half and half. But we think there's a multidisciplinary approach to safety information is very common. I think it should be the same in shortages, that there's a multidisciplinary approach, especially in cases where there is a big impact on patients and you need to use all tools available and reach out for patients. Also, there is a variety of communication tools used to reach the target audience, and not surprisingly, predominantly they are organization channels, patients, healthcare professionals, learner societies, also press releases on your website, and professional medical publications. I'll come back to that with a figure. And we also wanted to know whether they interact with their target audience in preparing their communication. And I think half of the respondents replied that they do interact with their audience. The question was, when preparing public communication, about shortages or availability issues? Do you engage with target audience, for example, in advice to healthcare professionals and patients? And I think we are a bit uncertain whether that's for dissemination purposes, that they want patient organization to disseminate specific information, or if they're actually reaching out for or interacting for advice in preparing communication. You know, what is a sensible thing to do in this and that situation? What is your views and so on? So not surprisingly, these patients and healthcare professionals are the main target audience for the information on shortages. I think that's quite sensible or ordinary. I think industry and other regulators, of course, if you publish something on your website, it's available for everyone. Also want to say that the communication with industry and wholesalers, that's a part of managing the situation, but it's equally important because I usually tell my colleagues that if you manage the situation with wholesalers, or if you have a good communication and interaction before we know what to do, that there's a good basis for the public communication to healthcare professionals and patients. So this is a figure on the interaction with the target audience. As you can see, there's basically half and half, and I think that's quite good. And not surprisingly, it's the healthcare professionals they're reaching out for, also learned societies, patient and consumer organizations. And also what kind of tools? This is what we ask. What other tools do you use to communicate besides shortage catalogue? And obviously, a lot is based on press releases on their websites. Keep in mind that do not do the maths, because keep in mind that this is select all that apply, and usually the agencies do use a lot of different tools. And I would say I'm not surprised that social media is quite small, because usually you would escalate and use all the tools available if there is serious impact on patients. So, and you can see that when it comes to electronic prescription systems, that's only 2 that has that as an available tool. But reaching out and trying to disseminate the information through organization channels, that's quite common. So all in all, I think it's a quite positive outlook, and I thought it was quite interesting from a communication perspective to get this overview, because I didn't know that there were so many shortage catalogues all over the European countries, because I've been looking for them myself but didn't find them, but now it's available. We think, as a conclusion, I think the current communication practices can benefit from better coordination across the network. I think Juan will go into that aspect, but we have a lot to learn from each other. You know, even though there is always management on the national level and different shortages in different countries, there are some things we can learn from each other and improving cooperation throughout the network, also on communication, and higher visibility and accessibility for patients and healthcare professionals. I think transparency in communication is very important in order to allow planning and efficient and practical management. And this will ensure adequate treatment for the patient, so that's for patient safety reasons. And also, I think a multidisciplinary approach within the agency to work with communication unit in your agency, especially for cases that needs to consider all the available tools if there is serious impact on patients, but also in working with the on the messages, that is lay language, it does. It's understandable for everyone who's on your website. That's quite important, and also how to have more interaction with target audience, and not just for dissemination purposes, but for reaching out and listening to what's the sensible thing to do. And I think that's quite natural to seek clinical advice outside the agency. What's the clinical practice on this product? If it ceases to be on the market, what's the consequences, and so on. So there's a lot to gain from having interaction both with healthcare professionals and patients. Thank you.
Thank you for this presentation. Now the feedback from panelists. Let's begin with Health Action International.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm Marcela Santos. I represent Health Action International. I is a member of the PCWP, and we bring the consumer and public interest voice in discussions on access to medicines. So thanks for the presentation. It has been interesting to see the results of the survey. I mean, unfortunately, drug shortages are common and an issue of increasing concern. So obviously, optimal communication becomes crucial to make sure that the situations are managed adequately and that the impact on patient care is minimized as much as possible. This is the last session, so a lot of things have been said already, but I'll mention some key recommendations and also echo some of the good proposals that have been made by some colleagues. So first of all, I want to emphasize the importance of timely communication. We as patients, consumers, but also healthcare professionals, we need to be warned in advance about shortages. So I think in this regard, the early notification measure foreseen in the directive should be enforced. And I mean, it has been mentioned also that it might not always be possible to foresee or expect the shortages. But the question here is those responsible, which in most of the cases will be companies, they have the obligation to notify as soon as they become aware of it. And not doing so should really have consequences. So I think regulatory authorities should also keep an eye on the way in which companies communicate on these issues and whether or not they do it timely. And then obviously we expect that as soon as the regulatory agencies become aware of it and are notified about shortages, they communicate the public. But that unfortunately doesn't always occur. So the second recommendation is we expect that the communication from the competent authorities is comprehensive. And for this, obviously, they need to know which information is important to patients, healthcare professionals, and consumers. So you have to consult with us when you prepare communication materials. And I think it's concerning to see that half of the agencies might not be actually engaging us in these processes. I think, information that is essential and should always be communicated is so the duration of the shortage. This has been mentioned already. So we need to know at best some estimates, and the information needs also to be regularly updated as new information comes along. I think it's also important to have a specific list of alternatives. I think this should be communicated, and some agencies do so. And not only to healthcare professionals, but also to patients and consumers. Although, of course, we should always be reminded that we have to talk to our doctor or consult with the pharmacist. If there are issues foreseen because of the potential switching to different treatments, I think these should also be communicated. And when the solution is to import a non-authorized product, I think it's important that patients also have access to a translated package leaflet. We have discussed this, and I think it can be provided in an electronic format. We've talked about apps. I mean, for us, it's really important that these apps are always managed by the regulatory authority, so not by companies. But it could be useful to notify patients directly through apps, or also, make the package leaflet available on the website, or also pharmacists could also print them for example, the elderly. And then lastly, we need effective communication channels. I think having centralized, publicly available databases is very important. They have to be regularly updated, but also promoted, because not everyone might be aware that these databases exist. And I'm thinking about consumers or patients as well. It would be also good to receive maybe directly news, like alerts from the DRA, the Medicines Agency. And then obviously patients and consumer organizations, but also healthcare professional organizations can help to disseminate the information through our channels, and it's good to see that this is being used already. But I want to emphasize something that has also been mentioned, and is that the communication has to be a two-way communication. So we should also be able to report on drug shortages, and not necessarily through the patient organization or the consumer organization only, but just directly. And also, I think it would be very interesting if we could also report about the impact that the drug shortage has on our care and healthcare. I mean, the survey published by the European Association of Hospital Pharmacists reveals that drug shortages can have serious consequences. I mean, not only in terms of delayed access to treatment or cancellation of treatment, but also lengthy hospitalizations, adverse drug reactions, medication errors, and even deaths. So I think this is information that it's very important that you collect to also have a better idea about the impact on patient care of drug shortages. And I want to finish by saying that obviously we have to strive to prevent drug shortages instead of trying to deal with the situation. But for that, it's important that we know the causes of shortages, so transparency is needed. The causes should always be publicly reported, including when we talk about commercial reasons and strategies used by companies. And I think that unethical practices should clearly be named and shamed. Concerning drug shortages, but also the unavailability of medicines. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Christine, for co-chairing this workshop and a safe trip back to Estonia. Okay, so we will continue then with the next panelist, so Doreen Posner, representing the Royal Dutch Pharmacists Association.
Thank you very much. The Dutch initiative has been mentioned a couple of times. What we experience in pharmacies is that patients come to the pharmacy and they expect to get a medicine, or doctors are expected to prescribe the best treatment for that patient. And when it's not possible, it's quite frustrating, or even worse. We've had the examples today, and this problem is not of the last week. Is already older, and as of 2004 we have created a website for pharmacists based on their reports on a possible shortage. It's on a national level, so we also have that. It's on critical and non-critical medicine. It doesn't matter to a patient what the criteria is. It also doesn't matter what the cause is. It's not there. On that website, we publish shortages which are always confirmed by the marketing authorization holder. We state what the cause is. We also state what the expected date of availability is, always according to what the marketing authorization holder tells us. And also when it's resolved is also mentioned on this website. We also provide a possible solution, and that can change depending on the patient. Based on our experience, we know that shortages have an impact on patients, direct and indirect. Direct to be switched to another product, or indirect if healthcare professionals have to spend a lot of time solving shortages, not doing other tasks, but also, for instance, to have an increase in healthcare expenditures. Talking about shortages, it's very critical that we have transparent information also, which can be seen by patients. Our website is publicly available, so everybody can have a look at it. Today already addressed a few times the definition of a shortage. To a patient, it is one thing, the product is not there. So we, with interest, we follow that discussion. Last but not least, the timely communication. 2 months in advance can be very short. It can also be, perhaps for industry, it can be very long. In practice, it's very short. Hopefully on all the Brexit shortages, we get notified 2 months in advance. And I think today has already stipulated that collaboration between all stakeholders is very necessary, especially on this communication. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then we move on to the European Union of General Practitioners and Thiago Villanueva.
Good afternoon. My name is Thiago Villanueva. I'm the Vice President-elect of the European Union of GPs, which is the umbrella organization in Europe for organizations that represent GPs at national level. Of course, I'm also a practicing GP. I'm very honored for the invitation today to be here. And I'm going to be very practical and pragmatic in my intervention. I've structured up 4 points to cover this presentation. So, my first point is that even though it seems all very reassuring that about 90% of medicines agencies in Europe provide information about shortages, but I don't find it necessarily easy or intuitive to find information about shortages in the medicines agencies' websites. I did look at a few websites today. I looked, of course, the ones that I could understand, the ones whose language I could understand: Portuguese, Spanish, French, English. And I found quite some degree of heterogeneity between countries. For example, I found the Irish Medicines Agency, HPRA, I think is a particularly good example. I think they seem to be doing a very good job. There's a highly visible link on the homepage. I found information on medicine shortages in the Irish Medicines Agency about 3 seconds after clicking on their homepage. They have a very visible link, and it's very practical. It tells you it's just from 2 days. They have the latest advisory from 2 days ago. It shows you. It tells you which drugs are missing. It also tells you which drugs are back and available. So I thought it's a particularly best practice that should be, and these practices should be identified and disseminated. So that was my first point. On the other hand, even though there might be good information, even though there might be information out there, that information may not be effectively reaching GPs because medicines agencies may not be targeting the preferred sources of information or hubs of information of GPs. I'll give you a few examples. For example, almost every good GP will have the web page of their national drug formulary open when they're seeing a patient. I always have it open when I'm seeing a patient so that I can just click on the name of a drug if I need some quick information, point of care information on side effects, on interactions, and so on. So, but there isn't, from my experience, there isn't information on drug shortages in drug formularies, and because of national drug formularies being online, you could provide information in real time on national drug formularies when GPs access them. I was very surprised. I was particularly actually a bit disappointed that only 7% of communication is conveyed through electronic prescribing systems, when that is actually one of the main sources of information about shortages. And actually, it's I'll tell you, Personally, I find out about shortages. The main source of information about shortages is when I'm clicking when I'm using my electronic prescribing software and I'm choosing a medication and that medication doesn't show up, and then I have the patient in front of me, and as you can imagine, it can be quite frustrating and even embarrassing when you have the patient in front of you. So there's quite a lot. So there's also a lot of room, just like for online drug formularies. There's much to do, for example, with electronic prescribing systems in real time. I thought there is also a lot of potential to improve penetration of information on social media. There was only 23%, and doctors and GPs are very high consumers of social media. I have to say that one of our main sources of information about shortages are our patients themselves. They come to us. Just 2 or 3 days ago, I had a letter from a patient. The letter just said, my nifedipine 30 milligrams extended release is not available anymore in the pharmacy. Please give me an alternative. Then my other point is that actually I had a chance to discuss this with Esther Martinez because it kind of follows up from her presentation. I think it's highly desirable that we not only provide information about shortages, but I think we can go beyond that. We can also provide information on alternatives. Perhaps some clinical guidance. If you don't have drug A, perhaps you could use drugs B and drug C. Now you can say, well, but you're the doctor. You're supposed to fix the problem, and of course we know how to fix the problem. But of course it is helpful that if we have some basic guidance on what are the alternative medications, because the alternatives may or may not also be available, for example. And switching to an alternative, I didn't hear much today about the human impact of drug shortages, but I mean, there is a huge human impact. When you switch to an alternative drug because of shortage, this is particularly a big problem in vulnerable groups, for example, like the elderly, who may mix up the drugs. For example, if there's a shortage of a drug and I have to prescribe an alternative drug to an elderly woman or man, I had that experience very recently, also just a few days ago. I explained to the patient 10 times, this is a patient with some cognitive impairment. I explained to the patient 10 times, you'll need to stop drug A and start drug B. And then after telling the patient 10 times this, she goes, did you prescribe drug A? And of course, it's also there's also the problem if the alternative is less effective, if the alternative causes significant adverse effects or interactions, or not less importantly, causes insecurity about the patient's illness being treated in the best way, and could even pose a threat to the patient's mental health, because patients may not want to switch and take the risk of not taking any medicines instead. Actually, I had one of my Dutch colleagues from UEMO just mentioned an actual case about the psychological impact of the shortage of medicines. There is a psychological impact to the shortage of medicines. This may not be a problem in big medical fields where there are many options, like hypertension or diabetes, but may not be so easy in areas where there aren't many options, or it is very tricky to manage a different option. For example, I cannot treat simple illness with the best possible and least harmful drugs if I'm forced to use, for instance, a broader spectrum antibiotic that is necessary, because this poses a risk for antimicrobial resistance. I think my final point, and I think Ancella already mentioned it, ideally we should be learning about drug shortages before they occur so that we can plan alternatives. For example, from a GP point of view, if I know that a drug is not going to be available in 2 or 3 months' time, I could provide longer refills. For example, instead of providing standard 3 to 6 month refills for chronic disease medication, I could provide, for instance, 1 year, and that will already cover the period where the drug will not be available. And I also wondered, after discussing with Esther Martinez, whether GPs should also be notifying shortages. I think that could be a useful option, but of course it would add to our already significant burden of work, because I mean, just to give you an idea, already notifying adverse drug reactions, which is one of our responsibilities as physicians, is already a very cumbersome process. I lose at least 1 hour at best just notifying an adverse drug reaction, and that's today, when it's much easier than a few years ago. And I think, and I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. And then finally, the viewpoint from pharmaceutical industry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to be very brief, but I will come back to one comment, just to say that blame and shame pharmaceutical companies due to commercial practices is a little bit a reduction of the debate. We all know that the issue is much more complex, that it's a multifaceted issue, that there are several drivers behind drug shortages, which varies from time to time, from country to country, from product to product. There are certainly anecdotal cases whereby members could be responsible, but there are also anecdotal cases where the distribution chain would also be responsible, and also anecdotal cases where the public policies are responsible for some potential shortages. So we need to be really balanced, and it's important to have a kind of collective understanding of the issue. I would like just to make one comment about the questionnaire, just because when I went through, I was a little bit surprised to see that there was no question on the source of the information about drug shortages, just because those systems have been developed independently, and obviously the information which are published on some of the medicines agencies' side do not cover only the information which is reported by manufacturers on quality or manufacturing issues, but it's also in some cases a little bit goes beyond in terms of source of reporting, of report of the information. Am I correct or not?
I'm not sure if I understood you correctly. All the questions to the agencies are not on that page, that's just some of them. But you mean that we should have information when we publish a press release, the source of shortage information?
So what I want to understand, just because we are discussing a guidance today where basically it's up to the marketing authorization holders to report information about any kind of disruption that could take place, at one stage. Normally this information, you centralize it, and I wanted to know whether in those information which are published by the various medicines agencies, whether they are the results of purely information which are reported by manufacturing authorization holders in the context of their requirements and obligations, or whether other sources are coming in.
These are notifications from the market authorization holders. The one that I'm familiar with publishing from my agency. But I mean, these are based on and how do you communicate shortages. That's not a specific detail we asked about. Yeah. No.
I'm not going to repeat all the things which were already said by my colleagues during the day. I think that the only message that I would like to pass is that it's really crucial that a plan for communication is agreed between the relevant competent authorities and the marketing authorization holders before any public communication outside the privileged channel is initiated. We need clearly to make a distinction between those suspected shortages and the genuine shortages. We need to have a risk assessment, need to distinguish between those products with no alternatives and those products which have alternatives. We need to have a step approach, communication with the supply chain actors before putting the information on the public domain. Last point that I would like to come back is that I think that, and we discussed this morning in the overall presentation, you have seen some information about the lack of availability of centrally approved products in some of the markets, when you see after 4 years that in some countries you have only 20% of the centrally approved products available, but in some countries you have 85%. Is it really as important to have information reported about shortages or potential shortages when you have citizens getting 85% of the centrally approved products when you have no information about availability of centrally approved products in some of the markets? And I think that it would be important to have a common reflection about the drivers and why you have less and less availability of centrally approved products in all the markets of the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we have been working today in a very cooperative atmosphere, and I would like to maintain that throughout the long journey, the very long journey that we are going to have in trying to find solutions. This is not about shaming and blaming anyone. As we have said at the beginning, this is a very multifactorial topic which will require a variety of solutions in order to make progress in this particular field. At the end of the day, you always have to look at it and what could happen to yourself. I mean, it doesn't matter if you work in a regulatory authority, in a patient organization, in pharmaceutical industry. At the end of the day, yourself may be confronted with a shortage problem even if you're unlucky in an area of unmet medical need. And then anyone will be very happy that a solution can be found in a very short period of time. I think we have to approach this in a very positive way, trying to find solutions to a problem which is there and that gets in where the severity of the problem even gets worse compared to a couple of years ago. And there are various reasons why we are confronted with this. So we also need to have a look at the validated information and how we best validate that information that there is a drug shortage. And I'm sure that through the whole the discussions about the notification, we will be able in order to make progress. So I give the floor now to Juan, and then we will conclude.
Thank you very much, Noel. And this is to present the proposal in which the Group 3 on communication has been working, very much based largely on the results of the survey that Inbil presented before, but also looking at all the experience. And I think we would like to come up with a guidance which give best practice or guides a little bit on the way that EU authorities could improve communication to the public, acknowledging how important it is in order to improve the management of the whole shortage issue. So what do we want to achieve? And I'm very pleased to see that some of these objectives that we set up are very much echoed by some of the participants, by patients, healthcare professionals, pharmacists. I think it's clear that we want to provide timely access to update information, and I think that the issue of up-to-date information is very important because we have listened that it's important to provide information about the shortage, but also when the shortage is resolved, on when it's expected to be resolved, the duration. So the whole initiative is to have a more harmonized approach, to have to address the issue of the different views, the different ways that national authorities and even EMA is communicating about shortages, and to be able to learn from each other based on the experience which we know work well. It's also important that we are able to increase visibility and accessibility of this information to patients and healthcare professionals, as even most of them is clear that they are not aware these resources exist at national level, that they could be accessing this information and can be used on their day-to-day practice. The idea is also to have more interaction with the stakeholders, and especially we have been listening to the possibility that even how we can explore and how can incorporate that patients and healthcare professionals can directly report, and this is reflected in the communication. So the proposed guidance that we are working is that, again, early involvement of stakeholders is key. That's something that we will need to work out, and I think is very much promoted, and the experiences which exist at national level are very positive. Regarding the tools, I think it's clear that everyone is looking for accessibility of this information in a single place. And we are not only talking at national level, but even we are talking at EU level. And the preferred way to present this information is a systematic listing, or the so-called catalog of shortages, which should include withdrawals and suspensions. So the timing, again, has been highlighted. I'm not saying nothing new here, and it has to be a good balance so that the information is properly validated, there is a proper assessment of it, but it allows a proper planning and continuity of care, and has to arrive to the patients and the healthcare professionals when they need to be prepared to take action. The target audience, we acknowledge patients, healthcare professionals, regulators, and industry, but I think it's important to ensure that in order to reach patients and healthcare professionals, this information is presented in the most friendly manner. And this also applies, and maybe back to the comment from Thiago, in a way which can be easily accessible through the different websites. The dissemination is more and more important, and in the sense that is the tools which are going to allow maybe to target and to individualize the information and to make a distinction between putting on the public domain a lot of information on shortages, but at the same time to be able to highlight those shortages which are really relevant, those shortages for which there is a specific action from healthcare professionals to take regarding switching, or specific messages which should be delivered in a very relevant manner. So this allows the use of different tools and channels, and also I think we have listened today a lot about the the possibilities that the digitalization is offering and the possibility that electronic product information can improve very much the way this information can be targeted and individualized to the different groups. Regarding the criteria or the information that we are proposing based on the experience is that there will be details of the medicines which have identified based on what national authorities are doing, which includes the trade name for sure, the active ingredient, information about the pharmaceutical form and strength, as well as the company. Details and availability, details of the issue, which mainly refers to the duration of the shortage and the anticipated date of resolution, as well as the reason why the issue happens. And then specifically if there is an advice to healthcare professionals. And again, this is to repeat what has been said regarding alternatives, regarding to any recommendation to healthcare professionals about switching, etc. So the preferred tool looks to be a catalog, and this is the catalog that we created for central authorized products in the EMA. And then as an outcome of the task force, we have now linked to all the existing catalog or information at national level. Of course, this is not the definite solution, but it's a step forward to have at least in a single place information which is across the network on shortages. In order to ensure that this can be delivered, and I think this not only applies to communication, it applies to all the management and prevention, I think it's important that we improve the way that information is shared within the network. And the idea is to build very much on an existing mechanism, because already mechanisms exist which are able to deal with these situations. But we would like to pull together information sharing for both centrally and non-central authorized medicines. The idea is to have a dedicated network, specifically on shortages across the network, which is able to streamline and work more efficiently on issues related to shortages. The idea is to optimize cooperation, coordination, and to be able to respond better and to better monitor and communicate on shortages. Finally, just to mention that the idea and what we are working is to consolidate all the output of the task force on all the different tools which will come out of this work in collaboration with all the member states and Commission and with the stakeholders, and to put them all together so that it will be what we are calling a regulators manual, EU regulators manuals on shortages, which in a way will give more visibility and easier access and will facilitate implementation of the measures that we will be able to put in place. So this will cover reporting, assessment, management, and communication. And I think we will keep everyone updated as this evolves and is developed. So again, thank you very much on behalf of Ingil and myself and all the work which has been done from the different representatives from member states on this group.
Yes, perhaps one or two questions, and then we have to move to the conclusions. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I mean, you will have no chair anymore otherwise at the end of the day. So, Hugo.
Thank you, Noel. I would like to make two remarks. One is connecting to what Thiago has already commented. I was wondering a bit, the news that Ingvil presented sounded very attractive, but at the same time, in the same survey, it was reported that only a limited number of NCAs already have decided on a decent definition of shortages. So I wonder a bit if it can be true that there are real catalogs available. I've looked at our own website. There certainly is a dedicated page to medicine shortages, but I wouldn't call that a catalog at all. So I think there may be something more behind it before we can really conclude that we're on the level of publishing real catalogs by a majority of NCAs. And the other one is to Juan. Of course, it's very positive that there's such a plan, but I would like to underline that it's very important to align this with the NCAs together in the HMA, because there may be strong consequences from such a plan which will filter down on the national level if it comes to publicity or whatever. So I think we need a real alignment between the developments taking place, for which, among others, EMA has taken the initiative, for which we're grateful, with what happens on a national level. It's not that easy.
Can I first? Yes, but I have. So there are 3 other persons who want to take the floor. So first, yes, please, ISGP. Yeah.
So just one comment or one warning of caution is that I think that Thiago, you hit the point, is that I think we need to also communicate about responsible treatment of information of the shortages, because one of the things you have suggested is that you would prescribe like a 1-year supply for a patient, which would mean that we would deplete possibly the stock much quicker. So I think when we communicate, it's very important, especially this is a plea from the industry to the regulators, that there's also a message to the healthcare professionals. I know, and I'm a healthcare professional by training, what you want to do is you want to take care of your patients, and you will do everything you can for the best interest of your patients. But here, when you talk about shortages, you need to think about global effect, you need to think about the whole population, you have to make sure that that communication which we are passing on also has that message that we have to be all responsible and consider maybe not prescribing the 1-year supply, but maybe thinking about whether alternatives are there or how to manage it in a different way. So this was just an immediate reaction because it just triggered one of the things that we should be avoiding actually rather than incentivizing.
Thank you. Let's try to be as short and brief as possible. Next one, the lady here from France. Yes, please.
Yes, I have a question about possible experiences at national level of sanctions imposed in order just to make sure that all companies, because we know that very good practices of companies setting up a system in order to be able to communicate shortages in time, but the communication in time is an issue. And do you have experience of this kind of sanctions, whether it helps to make sure that everybody cooperates and is proactive and communicates as early as possible?
Everything at the end. Okay, next one.
So I think it's a very good idea to have good practices. I just would like to raise one point to the task force. If you could think about the following: how the information about the reasons of shortages can be interpreted by the public or by some individuals. And I have in mind, for instance, anti-vaccine groups. Very practical example: if we have a quality issue during the manufacturing of a product, but the quality systems detect the problems and block the release. If we put into the public domain that it's a quality issue with the product, it can be interpreted, you see, and create confusion with products which are perfectly okay and which are on the market. So if you could, for instance, label that as manufacturing issue without creating any confusion between products which are fine and on the market and a product which is blocked by the quality system of the company.
And in any case, if you would have that situation, I think it would already be in the process of being addressed by the regulatory authorities. So, but you have a point that even if you would have, let's say, GMP non-compliance, whatever, or a serious quality defect, that we have to be careful the moment that we would put that into the public domain, if we don't know the root cause, for instance, or whatever remedial action can be taken. So that's an element that we will take into account. Yes, the lady from Romania, I'm sorry, I have to stop.
It's just a short recommendation raised by my colleague who left. Having in mind the increased role of the patients' organizations, unless the term patients is inclusive of the patients' organization, Pain Alliance Europe believes that the patients' association should be also stipulated in these documents.
Thank you. Shall I show my good heart? Okay.
I'll keep it very brief. Stephanie Cole from the European Association of Hospital Pharmacists. I just had a practical question on the follow-up of this meeting and whether you plan to involve the stakeholders that were present today also in future action. So, for instance, commenting on the deliverables via the participants of the healthcare professional working group and the patient working group at email.
We will address that. If we get to conclusions, we will address that. Okay. Can I propose then, is there anything that you would like to reply to the questions raised? But let's be as brief as possible from the panel.
One thing about the causes of shortages, how they are interpreted. We have the experience that patients don't want to shame and blame, but they want to have a cause in order to make an estimate if the date it's available is good. So if you have a production problem and you say it's there in a week, it's quite short. But if you say there is some logistical problem, they know within a week it can be fixed. So there may be a difference between the actual cause and how it is interpreted. Thank you.
Very brief.
Okay, very brief. Just about the comment I made. I mean, there are practices that are completely unethical, and for example, the case in Italy where Aspen threatened the case.
The case is under investigation. I'm sorry.
Please, no debate. No debate. So you have the floor.
Just to answer quickly to Hugo about the catalogs, that he was not sure that there is actual catalogs. Yeah, I have to say, from my experience this morning, surveying different national medicines agencies' websites, in many cases, actually, in most cases, I found it very difficult to find information about drug shortages. I actually couldn't even find it, to be honest. So the information is probably there, but the sites are difficult to navigate, and the information is difficult to find.
I'm just saying that there are situations which are unethical, and I think in these situations it's fair also to yes, name and shame. Why not? I mean, industry associations also name and shame sometimes when your companies breach the code. I've seen that in the case of pharmaceutical promotion, for example, and I've also seen, for example, an HTA body deploying the commercial strategies of some companies due to some shortages on vaccines. So I think I'm not saying that all drug shortages are, but there are situations which are completely unethical and due to commercial strategies that companies pursue.
Okay, but we will not shame and blame. We will try to find positive solutions to the problems that have been raised. Now, I would like to go to the final part of this meeting, which is concluding remarks and next steps. So we've tried to summarize a little bit today's workshop. Can I have the next slide? So I hope that we all agree that the availability of medicines is a national, European, and global matter. It has a significant impact on public health. It contributes to health inequalities. It's a long-standing problem. There are no quick solutions, but firm steps are being taken, and of course the actions that we have taken today, they need to be followed up. As we have said before, it's a multifactorial issue that must be tackled in close collaboration with all stakeholders. So coming back to the hospital pharmacist, yes, of course, we cannot come up now with final deliverables and then not make sure that also the stakeholders have their say in those final deliverables. If we will all agree at the end of the day, that will be a different matter, but we will consult. We need to identify all the factors, and that's what we try to achieve today, to have a complete overall picture and identify in which framework they have to be addressed and discussed. We will not be able to deal here with issues which have the more economical impact, pricing, reimbursement, but to have the picture and then to say to other parties concerned, this has been identified, please, there is this concern, try to address that. Next slide. There is a call for further harmonization, simplification of reporting, and improved communication. We acknowledge the important role of pharmaceutical industry in the prevention and management of medicines availability issues. Recognize that there are specific aspects that will require national, European, and global action by regulators and by all the stakeholders. Stakeholders' perspectives on how to address availability issues have provided rich input in today's discussions, and those will be reflected into the deliverables of the task force. Moving on to Brexit. We have been working on still on the assumption that the UK will become a third country after the 29th of March next year. That for centrally authorized products, we recognize that there are fewer medicines affected compared to nationally authorized products, but the situation as regards possible alternatives can be more difficult to address. The EMA is closely monitoring the CAPs considered critical. It's evaluating potential mitigating measures to minimize any disruptions in supply. For nationally authorized products, we are confronted with a large volume of medicines affected, and that the member states are working on alternatives at the national level. For veterinary medicines, we face similar issues as for human use medicines. What also became important is that preparedness is key, but also try to have as much pragmatism as possible and have adequate communication. Next slide. Addressing shortages caused by supply chain disruption, progress towards an EU-wide shortage definition is needed to improve reporting and further develop metrics. Important steps to improve reporting are more information around available alternatives. Reporting systems should be open to all supply chain actors. Further explore how to incorporate healthcare professionals and patients in the reporting process. And we should aim for a single portal for reporting. Specific feedback from stakeholders needs to be provided. Next slide. Communication, improving access to information on availability issues. Most EU EEA authorities already publish information on shortages. However, current public communication practices can benefit from more harmonization, a better coordination across the network, higher visibility and accessibility of the information by patients and healthcare professionals, and a multidisciplinary approach within agencies and more interaction with target audiences, and that can also include patients and healthcare professionals organizations. Next slide. In addition, information sharing within the EU network should be improved. Access to guidance on reporting, management and communication of shortages should be facilitated through the EU regulators manual that Juan was talking about. And final slide is in relation to the next steps. So proposals have been presented today, and we had an in-depth discussion. There is a need for further discussion by the task force and by all member states. There will be discussions at CMDH and CMDV later on at HMA and the EMA Management Board. We will, coming back to the questions asked, provide or seek for additional input from stakeholders through targeted consultations. Any comments on the workshop are welcome, and you have here the email address from the Secretariat. Please, not a tsunami, but let's be targeted. I think issues that have been raised today, we have taken note of, so if there is anything which has not been addressed and we would like to further clarify or which you would like to further raise, please do so. But we will anyway, on the basis of everything that has been provided today and presented today, develop a high-level meeting report which will be published on the EMA and the HMA websites. And the EMA, HMA, and I suppose also the European Commission will provide regular updates on the work of the task force and will consult as needed. So is this a fair reflection of today's outcome of discussions, or is there an important, with emphasis on important, element that has been overlooked? Yes, I think UK, yeah?
There's just one point I just wanted to address, and that is there's a lot of talk about notification to competent authorities of shortages, and there's a lot of talk about dealing with shortages, but it's really important to note that when the industry communicate effectively shortages to competent authorities, in the grand scheme of things, you're actually reducing the likelihood of a shortage. And I think it's really important to make that link.
Okay, thank you. We will take that into account. I'm looking around the room. So on that basis, we will prepare the high-level summary report. I would like to thank you all for the very constructive, also on behalf of my co-chair, for the very constructive discussions that we have held today. I would like to thank all speakers and all panelists, the members of the task force and of the different working groups, and the Secretariat for all the support that has been provided. And I wish you a safe journey back home. See you next time.